The story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 22 is one of the most dramatic stories in the Bible. God asked Abraham to do the unthinkable, sacrifice his son Isaac, the son Abraham had waited so long for. This request was shocking. It tested the very core of Abraham's faith. Abraham's response was extraordinary. He obeyed without hesitation. Early the next morning, he saddled his donkey. He took Isaac and 2 servants. They set off for Moriah, where God had directed him. His actions reflected a deep trust, a trust in God's plan and goodness. As they traveled, Abraham must have been conflicted. What father wouldn't be? Yet, he continued on, putting one foot in front of the other. His obedience wasn't just outward. It was a testament to his inner faith. He believed that God knew what he was doing. Abraham's willingness to follow such a painful command showed immense faith. It wasn't blind faith. It was a faith built over years of walking with God, a God who had never failed him. Isaac wasn't just any child. He was the child of the promise. Abraham and Sarah had waited for him for decades. God had promised Abraham descendants as numerous as the stars. This promise seemed impossible. However, through Isaac it had begun to be fulfilled. Isaac's birth was a miracle. Sarah laughed when she heard she would have a son. She was old, Abraham even older, but God had made a promise. Hebrews 11:17-19 highlights Abraham's belief. He reasoned that God could raise the dead. Even if Isaac died, God's promise would live on. Abraham's journey of faith wasn't without its difficulties. He had moments of doubt. He tried to fulfill God's promise through Hagar, but God had a plan. Isaac was the plan. Abraham learned to trust in God's timing and methods. Isaac represented hope and the future. Sacrificing him meant risking everything. Yet, Abraham believed in God's faithfulness. He trusted that the promise wouldn't die with Isaac. The journey to Moriah must have been filled with silence. Isaac, carrying the firewood, asked a piercing question. "Where is the lamb?" Abraham's answer was simple and profound. God will provide. A declaration of faith in the midst of uncertainty. At the top of the mountain, Abraham built an altar. He tied Isaac up and placed him on the wood. With his heart full of anguish, he prepared to obey. He raised the knife. At that moment, an angel called to him, "Do not lay a hand on the boy." Relief flooded over Abraham. God had tested his faith. A ram appeared, caught in a thicket. God provided the sacrifice. Abraham called the place Jehovah Jireh. It means, "The Lord will provide." It was a moment of divine intervention, a testament to God's provision. This scene wasn't just about a test. It was about a revelation. God never intended for Isaac to die. It was a test of faith, a way to show Abraham the depth of his trust in God. The story of Abraham and Isaac foreshadows another sacrifice, one that would happen centuries later. God's own son, Jesus, would be the ultimate sacrifice. Unlike Isaac, Jesus carried his own cross. He was the lamb that God provided for the sins of the world. This parallel is amazing. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac reflects God's willingness to give up Jesus. The location is also significant. Moriah is believed to be near Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. God's provision of the ram points to Jesus as the lamb. Jesus' sacrifice wasn't stopped, it was completed for us. Through his death and resurrection, God fulfilled his promise, a promise of redemption and eternal life. Just as Abraham trusted God, we are called to trust in Jesus' saving grace. The story of Abraham and Isaac deepens our understanding of God's love, a love that sacrifices and provides. It calls us to see God's plan in a new light, a light that shines through Jesus Christ. Abraham's story teaches us about the power of obedience, an obedience that leads to miracles. When we trust in God, even when it's hard, we open the door to divine blessing. Abraham's obedience brought him closer to God. It reaffirmed the promise. Trials are not meant to break us. They are paths toward blessing. God tests us to strengthen our faith, to deepen our relationship with Him. Abraham's test was a way to better understand God's character. We are reminded that during trials, God remains faithful. God's provision is always timely. Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." It became a truth for generations. God's provision may not come when we expect it, but it always arrives on time. Just as God provided the ram, He provides for our needs. These lessons are timeless. They apply to our lives today. In our own trials, we can find hope in Abraham's story, a story of faith, obedience, and divine provision. God's timing is perfect. Abraham learned this on Mount Moriah. His test ended with God's provision at just the right moment. The ram appeared right when it was needed. This teaches us patience and trust. In our lives, we face times of waiting for answers, provision, clarity. Abraham's story reminds us that God's time is not our time. It encourages us to trust in God's perfect plan. We often want answers right away, but God knows when to act. He sees the whole picture. His provisions arrive when they will have the greatest impact. Like Abraham, we are called to trust and wait. Faith is believing in what we cannot see. Trusting in God's timing is a key part of that faith. It assures us that God's plans are good. His timing is part of His perfect purpose for our lives. The story of Abraham and Isaac is more than just an old story. It's a call to action. It invites us to think about our faith. Are we willing to trust God with our own Isaacs, to obey even when it's hard? Abraham's test of faith is also ours. We are called to trust in God's promises, to believe that He will provide, that He is working for our good. His tests are opportunities for growth. Let's apply these lessons to our lives, to walk in obedience, to embrace trials as blessings in disguise, and to rest in the certainty of God's provision. This is a journey of faith, one that requires courage and trust. As we reflect on Abraham's story, let's find inspiration. Inspiration to live lives of faith like his, trusting fully in the God who provides,